Hello, and welcome to this week's video warm-up. This week's topic centers on the role of experience in learning. We want to think about the role of experience, such as hands-on opportunities that are commonly thought of as experiential learning, but we also want to remember, as both learners and educators, the importance of past experiences for framing new learning opportunities. Particularly in the workplace, but also in formal education settings, there is the matter of making learning authentic. That is, providing experiences for learning new knowledge that are situated in the context where the knowledge is used, created, or both. We have two significant objectives to try to accomplish this week. One is that hopefully you'll be able to explain the significance of experiential and situated learning in classroom and workplace learning settings, and to use concepts from the text to analyze examples of your own successful or perhaps unsuccessful experiences with experiential learning, whether those be as a learner or as an instructor employing these approaches. Let's take a moment to recall the 6 core principles that Knowles attributed to adult learning, and in particular to andragogy. And here's the diagram that we used to look at those a few weeks ago. One of those core principles is the observation that adults, more so than children and adolescents, have a deep well of both personal and professional experiences that frame future learning. We've already considered in previous modules how both learning and instruction benefit from drawing out these experiences, including potential misconceptions. We've also looked at this diagram in a couple of previous warm-up videos. The experience component of adult learning is visible in this representation too, in a very explicit way, as I've highlighted here. But if we look more broadly at the motivations, needs, and engagement of adult learning, there are many aspects of the learning process that benefit from being actively engaged in experiential learning. When mentioning experiential learning, many people initially think of hands-on learning, where that happens in schools, in college, in professional schools, or in the workplace. But some experiential learning arguably takes place in more formal classroom settings too, where learners undertake authentic tasks and projects using approaches that are pertinent to professional work and not only to academic work. We can also relate this week's topic to our previous consideration of the brain in learning, especially how memories are made and retrieved. We briefly saw previously that memory can be divided into declarative and procedural memories. Learning how to do something clearly requires a hands-on experiential learning experience. You wouldn't want a doctor to intubate you in the emergency room, or someone to build your house on the basis of reading a book, listening to a lecture, and then taking a test. Much of the knowledge about how to do something also can't be conveyed by verbal or written explanation. The tacit knowledge of doing things comes from watching, doing, and receiving feedback. And if there is risk involved, some of the experiential learning of tacit procedural knowledge will come through simulated learning experiences or from apprenticeship to an expert. The expertise that we develop in disciplinary knowledge falls within the realm of declarative memory. But here too, active, authentic experience is probably important. When it comes to subject matter expertise, we usually think first of semantic memory, the acquired facts, knowledge, underlying principles of the field. Episodic memory is something we most commonly think of as simply being the memories of the things we've done in life and the people we've done them with. But I hypothesize that relationships between semantic and episodic memory are at least partly responsible for the evidence that experiential and active learning is more effective than traditional didactic instruction. Neuroimaging research shows that episodic memory triggers semantic memory and vice versa. And upon reflection, I can't connect any declarative memory knowledge with a particular memory of a lecture. But I can relate learning that I've accomplished in lab experiments and projects all the way back to middle school. Active learning experiences are events in episodic memory that then trigger semantic memory. And this notion is captured in the oft-cited Chinese proverb shown here in the cookie fortune. I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. Most of what comes in through the auditory cortex is not remembered. Things we see, we tend to remember as having happened, although we may not remember much beyond that. For instance, there is a research literature in science education that shows how teacher demonstrations are remembered by students because of what the demonstration showed, especially if it was dramatic, such as something catching on fire or a liquid changing color. But the actual conceptual knowledge that the demonstration was intended to generate a memory of is generally not remembered, even a few weeks later. But when someone is actually involved in doing something, they understand it more fully and are more likely to remember it. Again, I suspect that this is because of interaction between episodic and semantic memories. Any discussion of experiential learning is incomplete without some mention of David Kolb's experiential learning cycle, which is presented in your text reading for this week. Kolb was a business management professor at Case Western Reserve University in Ohio when he developed this concept in the 1980s. Kolb proposed that all learning begins with a concrete experience that activates the senses to bring in new information through what we hear, what we see, what we touch and handle, and perhaps in some cases by what we smell. Next, Kolb suggested that we reflect on what this knowledge means, what this new information is meaning to us in light of things that we remember from the past. This step of the learning cycle connects to what we've learned previously about the importance of prior knowledge. Next is the combination of past and present experiences to generate new understanding and ideas. With these new ideas, we take new actions through conversation, writing, or trying something out. This active experimentation stage then generates a new concrete experience that starts us around the cycle again. Notice the importance of experiences for learning throughout Kolb's cycle, starting with something that is experienced through one or more of the senses, that is then joined with memories of past experiences to generate a new active experience. This might seem obvious and not worth stating, but what Kolb wanted to emphasize is that many learning opportunities don't include the whole cycle. For instance, a lecture that only leads to the expectation of repeating what was said without connecting with prior knowledge or generating new ideas to be experienced by others. I think it would be fair to say that there is very little controversial about Kolb's cycle, and you may find it a helpful way of visualizing effective learning processes. However, you should know that another aspect of Kolb's work that is presented in your text has not been as well received by all learning scholars. Kolb extended his synthesis of the learning cycle to advocate a means of characterizing learning styles. He started by noting two axes of learning within his cycle diagram. A connection between active experimentation and reflective observation, he surmised, showed potential differences in how learners process information by doing versus watching. The other two stages in the cycle were viewed as differences in how one perceives incoming knowledge as something that's felt or acquired through thought. With these two axes drawn, the diagram was divided into quadrants that were espoused as representing four different learning styles. Converging learning style, for instance, was demonstrated by someone who learned by doing and thinking, versus diverging learning that focused on feeling and watching. Kolb suggested that learners would enter the cycle through the quadrant that referenced their learning style. This inference led to objections on a couple of grounds. One, it seemed unreasonable to many that one could enter a new learning experience without a concrete experience first, that the cycle really had to start at that node. Secondly, the survey instrument that Kolb developed with the intention of identifying learning preferences in the four quadrants has not survived rigorous tests for reliability and validity. Nonetheless, it is common for organizations and your textbook authors to recommend that employees and students take the survey to determine their learning style. Kolb once famously responded to a criticism of low reliability of a survey that high reliability was not expected because learning styles were very difficult to measure. That retort, however, only seemed to acknowledge that the learning style scheme he developed could not be justified to exist, and certainly not measured by a survey. Such challenges to some learning style instruments have, unfortunately in my mind, tainted the water for all learning styles inferences in research. More generally, by leading to the assumption that all learning style surveys are unreliable, invalid, or both. However, there are approaches to characterizing preferences from learning that have met with rigorous psychometric expectations, and have been shown useful to describing and possibly explaining different learning outcomes for students. So let's let go of Kolb's learning styles for the moment and come back to the experiential learning cycle as a model for describing effective learning. Besides the validity that this model might have for you based on your own experiences, we can also relate it to our earlier topic of learning from a neuroscience and cognitive psychology perspective. Recall that we consider the roles that different parts of the outer part of the brain, the cerebral cortex, play in the learning process. This is a very generalized view for sure, and some learning activities activate multiple areas of the brain simultaneously, as measured by neuroimaging tools. However, this diagram is a reasonable place to start, and the picture comes from a synthesis of relevant neuroscience for the benefit of college teachers that was authored by Jim Zoll. Interestingly, Zoll was a biologist at Case Western Reserve University, the same institution where Kolb spent most of his academic career. Zoll integrated his view of the brain during learning with Kolb's learning cycle. The key idea is a general association of the four lobes of the cerebral cortex with different primary activities during learning. Sensory input near the rear of the brain, integration and encoding in the temporal lobe in the bottom part of the cortex, manipulation and sense-making of information in the frontal lobe, shown in blue here, and the motor cortex, shown in green, which essentially controls everything that represents physical activity. Zoll then wrapped Kolb's cycle around this view of the brain. Concrete experiences come into the brain through the sensory part of the cortex, back there in the pink part in the rear. Prior knowledge required for reflection is stored in long-term memory in the temporal lobe in yellow. The new and old experiences are then manipulated in working memory in the frontal lobe, the blue part of this diagram, in order to generate new understanding, which is then spoken, written about, or acted upon through the stimuli activated in the parietal lobe at the top of the brain, shown in green. In other words, in at least a general way, we can connect experiential learning processes to the way the brain processes inputs and outputs during the learning process. The final topic I'd like to talk about for a few minutes is the importance of situated learning in the workplace. You'll likely recall this graphic from the video warm-up in our self-directed learning module. Jennings' 70-20-10 concept is not a firm rule for sure, but it reminds us of the importance of learning through experience in the professional world. Notice that some of the examples of learning on the job in the 70% category are done with others and not alone. Add to that 70%, the 20% of learning that is directly related to learning with and through others, and you've got as much as 90% of workplace learning accounted for in at least some cases. The importance of social learning in the workplace is at the core of the concept of situated learning. Much of the essential early work on situated learning was undertaken by Jean Levé. It's the idea that learning that is meaningful is embedded in authentic work in the field, and that includes the fact that most workplace work and learning is done within a body of activities and social interactions that are appropriate for the organizational culture. One of the best known ideas to emerge from the situated learning paradigm is the idea of communities of practice, which Levé developed with her colleague Etienne Wenger. Wenger has gone on to champion the approach in several books. Communities of practice, or COPs as they're often referred to, are usually informal groups that arise spontaneously or sometimes are seeded by management in order to further intrinsically motivated increases in knowledge. The idea is that if you bring together people who share a passion and a problem, they will be able to find solutions through their shared knowledge and their shared capacity to innovate. So the purpose really of the COP is to provide those opportunities to work in a group to develop new individual capabilities within the workers. COPs are different from project teams, task force, and most committees because of each member's personal commitment to the community's domain of interest rather than to a set of tasks. Members are connected by their interdependent knowledge rather than interdependent tasks or a specific achievement goal. Success is about growth and mutual solidarity and knowledge rather than the quality of some particular product. COPs have no set duration and no set membership. People come and go or lurk at the periphery depending on the current agenda and the person's available time to contribute and participate. Leadership is commonly shared with a coordinator, mainly existing to build agendas from community interests rather than to dictate an agenda. OIL's doctoral student Adriana Stark has been working with me on the nurturing of COPs in the faculty development arena at UNM. Our premise is that professional learning among teachers should include more leverage of teacher expertise. Professional development programs usually lack the resources to deal with every faculty need, and arguably from the 70-20-10 framework, most of the valuable learning isn't going to take place during formal training, such as workshops. Adriana and I have mostly been working alongside and nurturing COPs on UNM's main campus in two areas. One is with groups of faculty and graduate students within science and math departments that are working together to redesign the entry-level courses in their programs. The other COP consists of faculty, graduate students, and student support staff that either teach in or have interests related to instruction in technology-rich learning studio classrooms, where active learning replaces lecture in classrooms enrolled by as many as 126 students. Teaching in the studios is a challenging adjustment for many instructors, but rather than rely on scattered professional training opportunities that relate to pedagogical strategies and classroom technologies, the instructors increasingly rely on each other, and the community of practice is building an impressive archive of knowledge for use by new instructors. COPs are also of growing interest where I work in the UNM Medical School. You may recall me mentioning entrustable professional activities in an earlier video warm-up. Constructing these EPAs as a basis for assessment and instructional design with medical students and residents is of increasing importance across the medical school curriculum at many levels. Writing EPAs and developing assessment plans for them is, however, very challenging. My office has seeded a virtual community of practice where faculty can share ideas, review each other's documents, and develop shared expertise in this domain of teaching and assessment. So as you're doing the reading and thinking about your 4R for this week, some things that you might think about from watching the video is to think about what experiential learning activities have you had, either academically or professionally. And how did those learning opportunities compare to classroom learning? How did they feel at the time? How engaged were you? How much do you remember from them as contributing to your overall body of knowledge? And also maybe think about whether you've ever been part of a community of practice, whether it was actually formally labeled as such or not. And to think about what role this engagement with colleagues that shared a passion and interest and expertise and knowledge and a common domain of interest would play in, or has played in your learning. So I look forward to reading your 4Rs this week and watching you engage in discussion of your ideas. Adios.